Now, Pat Algers, President of Chemistry in Place, will introduce our speaker. Pat?
Good afternoon. I am so pleased to be here as a Rotarian and a board member of the Congress for the New Urbanism. But as a Milwaukeean and an urbanist, I stand proud of the last decade of amazing developments in our central business district, diverse and authentic neighborhoods and region. We have become a place on a Great Lake that has become so attractive that we have secured the DNC 2020. Our audience is now global. So all the more apropos to have Lynn Richards with us today to share her insight on urbanism and placemaking. Lynn Richards is President and CEO of the Congress for the New Urbanism. CNU is an international organization whose members specialize in planning, building, and rebuilding vibrant and walkable cities, towns, and neighborhoods, where people have diverse choices for how they live, work, play, and get around. Richard's work as CEO advances a movement in support of well-designed cities, towns, neighborhoods, and public places that help create community, healthy places for people and businesses to thrive and prosper. As head of CNU, Richards has launched the organization's Project for Code Reform, which helps local governments in reforming their codes to strengthen communities. Additionally, under her leadership, the organization has released 2 editions of Freeways Without Futures, 25 Great Ideas of New Urbanism, and Building Local Strength, Emerging Strategies for Inclusive Development. Freeways Without Futures is a guide to converting select urban highways, such as Milwaukee's Park East Freeway, into boulevards integrated into neighborhoods like Milwaukee's Deer District and Water Street North End. An internationally recognized speaker and leader on new urbanism, Richards has presented on a range of topics, including economic development, highway removal and transformation, suburban retrofit, green infrastructure, and new urbanism trends. New urbanism can have big impacts. Like Daniel Burnham said, make no little plans. Welcome, Lynn. We are so happy to have you today here at Rotary Club of Milwaukee to talk about creating places people love.
I hope I can live up to that introduction. All right, try to get all settled up here. So, thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. When Ken Voigt, who actually hired me into this position a chunk of years ago, called, I said, "Well, Ken, I'll do just about anything for you." So, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I want to talk a little bit today about what I call creating magic. So many people think when they see a revitalized community that it is something that was otherworld. It just kind of came out of nowhere. And I want to try to break it down for you a little bit on how that can happen, and then what you all can do to address some of the areas that might need more revitalization, or how you can make Milwaukee just that much better. I was walking around this morning getting coffee, and I'm in the 3rd Ward, and I was already just so impressed with how far you all have come. You guys have a great city. There's so much to build off of here, and I think you guys are just like on this momentum. So let's start there. When we talk about what it takes to build a community, so many folks kind of talk about what the street design is. They'll talk about what the houses should be. They'll talk about the structure, but really, aren't we talking about people and how the people inhabit the spaces? So I would like to challenge you all today to start thinking about, when we say building places people love, is to put people front and center, to put yourself front and center of how you want to experience your neighborhood, your city, your region. What's going to make your life easier? What's going to make your life better? How is it going to be enhanced? And so when we talk about great places, right, so many folks from CNU will say, well, it needs to be walkable, right? It's healthy, sustainable, profitable. It needs to be pedestrian friendly and have a range of different ways to get around. And sometimes that can be transit, sometimes that can be pedestrian. We call it mobility. But great places is about people. So we need to ensure that we're creating spaces that include the public realm, open space, and it has to be inclusive. We are not doing our job as leaders in this community, as placemakers, and city builders, if we're not ensuring that the benefits of a great community, a great city, is felt by everyone who lives in that city, right? So how do we create inclusive, equitable places for everyone? And at the same time, how do we ensure that these places have a great first mile, last mile? You guys have an emerging streetcar network. It's not emerging. You have a streetcar network. You have a bus system. Sometimes it works great in helping people get around. Sometimes it could do a little bit more. So how can we solve the first mile, last mile? Is it going to be autonomous vehicles? Is it going to be your bike share, Lyft? There's electric scooters. I personally hate electric scooters. Everyone, but I do know, no, that's just, it's part of this, but I don't like them. Anyway, sorry. Little editorializing, and this is going to be live, so I'm going to get all these calls. Oh, scooters are such part of it. But at the end of the day, we're going to solve the first mile, last mile problem by creating places that are walkable, right? I live about a mile from our metro, and I'm from DC. I live about a mile away, and I've been living in this house for 22 years. And yes, I did try to sign a 6-month lease when I first moved in. And for 22 years, I have been either walking or biking. Occasionally, I'll drive if it's black ice, but increasingly, it's just all on my bike. And that's a successful neighborhood. Not every place can get there, but I think that's our goal, right? Great places also have the resilience and the wherewithal to solve challenging problems. Climate change is the new normal. However we got here, it's the new normal, so how are we going to effectively address it? And a great sustainable places that people love, have that ability to adequately address it. This is Stapleton, which is an old airport. It's about 1,500 acres out of Denver, and they've integrated their stormwater management into the new development and connected to trails all around. And when I start thinking about what a great place is, places people love, it includes this kind of environmental sustainability. I also think we're at a point where we need to start talking about food production and how we can begin to increase our food production within our neighborhoods and in our communities. What Pat didn't say in my bio, which everyone finds a little bit odd, is I lived and worked in the former Soviet Union, and at that time it was the Soviet Union, for about 7 years in the early part of my career. And the dachas, which are the small cottages that the Russians have, back in the day when I was there, represented about 80 to 90% of the food production. And right now, in 2015, it's 40% of the food production. So imagine that, backyard gardens doing 40% of the food production. We have an issue kind of nationally around homelessness. We have an issue with folks living below the poverty line. We have issues with public health. Think about how we can use our connective tissue within a neighborhood to help increase food production. And then also thinking about new trends in energy production. These are, when we're talking about places that people love, when we're talking about complete neighborhoods, it is not just about having a walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented, transit-friendly place. See how quickly I came off with that? Because that has been the shtick for the last 25 years. We must think more broadly to include the social aspects, to include solutions that help address the emerging needs. So, what I like to say is if you build a place for cars, you're going to have a place that's going to get cars. And for so many years, and Ken really taught this to me well as a former board member, he and I got quite close. The engineers were designed in school to help move cars from point A to point B. So when we are designing our cities that effectively move cars and we're blaming the transportation engineers, they're doing exactly what they were taught to do. So let's take that paradigm and just turn it on its side. Because nobody, well, let me ask you, who gets up in the morning just so excited to sit in traffic? Right? Like the car is a mechanism. What we're really looking for is mobility. We want increased mobility. We want to be able to move efficiently and effectively from point A to point B. And we want to enjoy ourselves getting there. So what happens if we begin to design and build for people? And so, since this is a Rotarian, I wanted to throw in a couple of economic slides because I'm just not talking pie in the sky. That when you begin to build a place for people, you're going to see an increase in your walk score, and that's going to translate into about $100,000 home premium. Let's, for the sake of argument, just for the moment, park the issues around equity and inclusiveness in the bike rack, because these are two different, they're the same issue, but for the moment, I want to demonstrate that there's strong economic value in designing and building places for people. What we have found in the walkable urban spaces of the 30 largest metro is that there's a 74% increase in rent. And certainly in the Arlington County, we adopted a new urbanist plan in 2002, and Amazon has just selected Arlington County for its second headquarters. These two issues are not connected. These two issues are connected. Sorry, double negative. The retail experience is a social gathering area. We talk a lot about first floor retail as creating that vibrancy on the streets, but what the new generation, Gen Z, right, which is my son's age, those are the kids that are in high school and college, and the millennials, they're less about buying things and they're more about creating an experience. So increasingly, we're going to see our cities transform into something that creates experiences, which is great because when you're focusing on experiences versus buying stuff, all of a sudden now you're opening up the doors to have more people participate. Right? And then cycling and walking investments. This is Argyle Night Market. They won a charter award last year. Argyle, which is a northern neighborhood in the Chicago and the north sides, it's in the Chicago. But nationally, what researchers have found that you get a return of almost $12 for every dollar invested in bicycling and cycling. Mick Cornett, sorry, I pronounce things terribly, former mayor of Oklahoma City, is a Republican. And he has done amazing things to Oklahoma City in terms of investing in biking and walking infrastructure. And I talked to him at a meeting, and I was like, you don't see too many Republican mayors really getting out in front on these issues. And he was like, I'm just doing it for economic development. We're having a public health crisis. We're having an economic and fiscal crisis. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone and invest in our walking and biking. And to me, that feels like a winning combination. So how do you do it? So if I've just laid out and you're all like, yes, let's do this, right? Bringing you right up to the edge, how do we do it? So I'm going to talk really briefly about 5 strategies that from what I've read in Milwaukee, you all could or need to do right now. The first is fixing your local codes. The codes, whether they're zoning codes, street design ordinances, your stormwater, the codes are the DNA of any community. You see some development out on the edge that you don't particularly like, don't blame the developer. They're not the bad guy, they're the good guy. They're following the playbook. Change the playbook, you're gonna get better or different development. You're gonna get the development that you want. A great example of this, there's a lot of examples, but the one that I go to is Columbia Pike, again in Arlington County. They changed their code in 2003, and what the developer said in the newspaper, in the Washington Post at the time was, that's it, I'm gonna retire here. Like, this is the life's work now because everything is clear, transparent, and we can just move along. And then since the change in the code, you've seen 1,500 new housing units. I think another 1,500 are planned. You guys can read this slide, I don't need to. But it's an example of if you make it easier to do the type of development that you want to have happen, it will happen. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of big issues in changing your codes, though. The biggest coding issues around parking, stormwater, street design, lot sizes, setbacks. When you're trying to create a big walkable place and your house is set back 20 feet, like next time you're walking in your neighborhood, if you're in a single-family detached home where the house is set back, think about how you feel when the house is set back. And then next time you're walking in a downtown area and you're really driving on it, check in with yourself and how does that feel? They're very different experiences. But the problem with changing your codes is that it's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly complicated, requires a lot of time and political will. Code Next in Austin is a great example of how hard this is. Code Next in Austin has spent $8 million changing their codes. And no, nothing is adopted. In fact, the mayor now is at the precipice of actually going in a new direction, just like walking away from that. Imagine $8 million. So, this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. As Pat said, we launched the project for code reform. So I took this issue. It was like, if it's going to take so much money and time and effort to change the codes, and changing the codes are so essential to getting the type of development that you want, what happens if we just turn it on its side? Why do we need a 500-page code rewrite? Can't we just start with, if you do nothing else, do this? And that's exactly what Rick Bernhardt, the planning director in Nashville, did to begin to transform Nashville. He's like, let me just start with one thing. And I love this incremental idea because it empowers your suburban communities like Wauwatosa. It empowers folks within Milwaukee. It empowers the planning directors in all the small towns that make up your region to say, you know what, we can start this. We can start just one thing. And so what this idea of starting where you are is it changes the paradigm from doing a code reform that guarantees a great place. That's the 500 pages. That's the $8 million of Code Next. And instead says, if you do nothing else, just do one thing. And what is that one thing? We call it the arc of engagement. And so we look at, what do you need to do just that one thing? How is it going to be different if you're in your main streets, your downtowns, and the kind of adjacent areas? I mean, think of it. Your parking requirements are going to be different for your downtown area than they are for your residential area, right? That's all this is saying. So think broadly about, how do you want your different neighborhoods, your different types of neighborhoods within a town to look and feel. And then again, across these major areas of coding issues that I talked about earlier. I'm trying to go quickly. You guys are on time, so I'm trying really hard to end on time. And so that's what we call the Enabling Better Places, the user's guide to zoning reform. And we released this document in the state of Michigan in 2018, just about a year ago now. And this project has totally taken off because instead of working directly with each community, there are 42,000 units of local government in the United States with zoning authority. That is a really big job. There's 50 states. What happens if we identified the most essential coding fixes that can occur within each state? Within each state's kind of enabling legislation, because clearly the coding issues that you're going to have in Michigan are going to be very different from New Mexico or from Maine. And so that's what we're doing. To date, we've worked now in 3 states, and we're beginning to look at the incremental code reform process for a whole city. To take that Code Next perspective of 7 years and $8 million and to do it for about $250,000 over 6 months. I'll let you know how that goes. Anyway, code reform. A key piece in so many cities like the Milwaukee, and I use Milwaukee as not only as a city, but also in the broader region. I was lucky enough to be able to do a little bit of work in Wauwatosa, or as Ken calls it, Tosa. I love that. It took me a while to say it, Wauwatosa. You guys have such great names for cities. But it's to build more missing middle housing. Think of it. We know our demographics are changing, right? In the 1950s, I think something like 55% of the population was a 2-parent and child-filled household. In 2020, that number is expected to be 23%. Our families are changing. Our housing needs are changing. So let's think about how we can be creative about changing where and how we live and what we build. This is an 8-plex, 4-plex. This is what we mean by missing middle. Duplex. A lot of folks are comfortable with duplexes. This is also a duplex that looks like a single-family detached home. These are cottage courts and accessory dwelling units where your college student can move into, or your aging parents. In Santa Cruz, they passed a ADU ordinance, I want to say in about 2004, and it was mostly used to, after you lived in your home and raised your kids, you moved into your ADU and you rented out your house. It was a way of aging in place so you can maintain your connections within the community. But the biggest part about really building more missile-living housing is that attainable housing gap. I read a little bit about Milwaukee, and I know, much like every single city in the United States, there's issues around affordable housing. And affordable housing can mean affordable with a big A, or affordable of, could my son, when he's out with school, come back here? Right, so let's start with this. How many folks here have lived in an apartment at some point in their life? How many folks now know somebody who lives in an apartment? So often when we talk about missing middle housing, when we're talking about multifamily, it's framed as other, if I may be so bold to say. It's like, it's for other people. No, it's for us. At some point in time in our lives, we've all lived in different types of housing. At some point in our life, we're all going to know people. Whether it is our aging parents, whether it is our children, whether it's our friends, whether it's like, I want to get out of my house and go live in a hip, cool condo downtown. But most importantly, when we talk about building more affordable housing, we close this attainable housing gap. We lower the cost of housing, and I know, Steve, there's a lot of issues around that, but we lower the cost of housing and we shrink it just a little. And that is worth real money when you're talking about subsidizing housing for lower income folks. If we're able to shrink that gap to get it a little bit closer, that's worth some real money and economics. So the number one thing, if we want to start, that's really easy for Milwaukee to do, is to legalize accessory dwelling units. Right. And what Santa Cruz did is that the city approved 5 designs, and if you did this 5 design, then you were golden. Like converting your garage and enabling somebody to live in your basement. So often it's not about building new, it's about converting or transforming what you already have. The other thing that Milwaukee can do is to start thinking about concessional coding, to how can we transform our single-family detached homes into multifamily. The form of the building stays exactly the same. So on the sorry, I don't know my left or my right. On the left is a single-family detached home in Chicago. On the right is a 3-plex. I know because I lived in the top floor when I was in Chicago when I started this job. We have a lot of single-family detached homes. How can we change our codes and ordinances to allow for that successional coding, that these places can at some point turn into multifamily? Because that's exactly what happened in Chicago. These old homes, what happened in New York City. We have a long history in the United States of this kind of transformation. Kind of controversial is to actually stop allowing exclusionary single-use zoning for your single-family detached homes. And I know, the Twin Cities has just done this. We're not talking about changing the design of these particular places. We're just saying, you know what, if somebody wants to keep the design of the house the same, but have it as a multifamily, let's go ahead and do that. There's a lot of issues around affordable housing, and I think it requires a whole suite of solutions. These are just some of them. And then again, expand and allow the notion of housing. Arlington County, again, has a huge housing crunch in that it's difficult now for us to attract teachers, high school teachers, right? So we have some empty parking lots. Can you allow some well-designed tiny homes as a temporary, like 3 to 5 year housing, 3 to 5 year lease limit? What are different ways that we can enable different types of housing situations? What about SROs, that single room occupancy, which have a really bad connotation for incredibly poor folks, but yet what we're seeing in Portland, where they're now being allowed, is that it's being used by folks who have kind of transitional housing needs, whether you're just out of school, you're just divorced, you're transitioning in your own life. And so these types of developments are actually really taking off. As our demographics change, I believe that our housing needs also need to change. And this is going to bring greater diversity, greater kind of vibrancy to our neighborhoods. Design really matters on these places. So this is a house that could be transformed. The code allows for this. Nobody would want this in their neighborhood, and this is why everybody says, no, I don't want this here. But what happens if it looked like that and that had 4 apartments? So when it comes down to it, let's check in with ourselves. Are we really upset about having this as 4 apartments, or are we really upset about having it look like that? I would argue that most of the time we're upset about having it look like that, and we would be fine with the 4-plex sitting there. Again, to enable a place for our teachers to live, our librarians, our fire chiefs. These are the issues, these are the people being crunched out of housing in some of our more successful cities. The other big issue that Milwaukee can do now is to start support incremental development. And the person who taught me the most about this is Majora Carter, who is an environmental activist in the Bronx. And we were talking earlier with somebody about this issue around gentrification. And gentrification isn't necessarily a bad thing. Gentrification means you're putting investment in areas that need investment. The issue is not about the investment or gentrification. The issue is, how can the legacy residents living there enjoy the benefits of that investment, have access to the opportunities, minimize displacement? Once you begin framing it around those questions and those issues, a suite of new approaches open up. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the Portland neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky. So Louisville, this Portland neighborhood had some really great bones. Like so many of our older cities, had a great stories, great history, great old buildings. Yet a lot of them looked like this. It wasn't even an issue of displacement. It was an issue around revitalization. And it cost about $10,000 to purchase this vacant home. And then it cost about $70,000 to rehab the home. So now we're in for about $80,000. Hold on. So yes, I've already been criticized that this is a terrible design of a house, but leaving that aside, let's just focus on the numbers. So at $80,000, our CNU member there can put a person living in that house for $650 rent. And that's $100 less than the Section 8 affordable housing for Louisville. It's $100 less. That person pays the rent for a year. Gil then walks into the local bank and says, this is the credit rating. The person is able to get a mortgage and move into home ownership. He's done 50 properties to date. This is not a huge impact, but it begins to provide a nugget of how we can think differently about revitalizing some of our areas where the legacy residents can benefit from that revitalization. We partner with a sister group called the Incremental Development Alliance that is going across the United States doing developer boot camps. Again, and we're calling on what Majora said, working with the local folks in that neighborhood to empower them to do their own development. And whether you just rehab one house and it's a duplex and you live in one unit and rent out the other, or fourplex and you rent in one and you rent out the other 3, how can we empower the folks living in these neighborhoods that need that revitalization? What can we do to partner with them to give them the tools to turn their own neighborhood around? What are the mechanisms in terms of the banking and the finance? How do you run a pro forma? How do you get the technical pieces? And this is a lot of what the Incremental Developer Alliance does, and we're close partners in providing them with a lot of support. They've had about 45 workshops. They've trained about 3,500 people. But in the last 3 years, they've completed 17 projects already with 70 units. Again, small scale, filling in the missing tooth, but it begins to see how you can transform a street that looks like this to a neighborhood hotspot. When we put developing for people at the center of the equation, a whole bunch of factors begin to change. So that's John, and they amplify the impact of the work by fixing codes and the result, local wealth creation. The fourth is leveraging infrastructure investments. This is really key. You all have the HOP, but to think more broadly about how infrastructure can be defined. This is particularly important in cooler real estate markets. Where and how the city and state spends its money on infrastructure can have a dramatic impact on where and how development and redevelopment happens within your city and your region. I was working in Topeka, Kansas once, and their main street was about half vacant. At the time I was working for the US EPA, and they wanted to do a green infrastructure project kind of out on the edge of town. I was like, why do you want to do it on the edge of town? Why wouldn't you want to do it on your main street? If the city begins to invest in infrastructure in those areas that need revitalization, that sends a clear signal to the private sector that the city cares about this. It's not foolproof, but it is a successful strategy. And Lancaster, California, quite a bit smaller than Milwaukee, but it's located about 100 miles northeast of Los Angeles. This was their main street. Cars went by at about 50 miles an hour. They didn't have a lot of money, so they spent $13 million on streetscape improvements, just $13 million. And they slowed traffic from 50 miles an hour down to 15 miles an hour. It became the central spot for the town, just what they wanted. But here's the take-home message. They invested $13 million. It returned $300 million in private investment. You build for people, people will come, the economics are there. I love talking about the Greenway, which is 5.5 miles and has seen almost $450 million in bike-oriented development. That is just... I can't wait to go to the Twin Cities, right? So we're beginning to see kind of a broader definition of how infrastructure investments are catalyzed. And then finally, it becomes so important to creatively engage the public. How many folks here work for the local government? A few. I'm going to get into trouble here. I would like to suggest that all public meetings that are from 7 until 10 o'clock at night, where people have 3 minutes to talk about what they want, for community feedback, are just prohibited. This is my job, and between 7 and 10 I need to cook dinner. I'm a single parent. Are you doing your homework? Has a dog taken for a walk? It is just crazy. Why can't we think creatively about how to engage the public on what we can do? This is just Blackboard. Where do you want to be? I took this picture 4 years ago in your town. I have to say, international audiences across the board has seen this, because I talk about being in Milwaukee about 4 years ago, driving to some place for dinner and seeing a parking lot with this chalkboard. So I immediately stopped and took pictures. You guys have this, how to creatively engage. Also in Minneapolis, they have rickshaws with a plan where they design what the city plan is. They put it in a rickshaw, and then city staff walk through neighborhoods and asking people to come out of their houses and say, what do you think? Let's think creatively about community engagement. And most importantly, we need to get people talking. And I would say that community engagement is also about drawing. When you have your public works official or your economic development director at a table with a map with trace paper in front of them and takes a pencil and draws a line through an abandoned parking lot to connect two streets, it's like, really? That's it? That's connectivity? Just Draw that line. That's what we're talking about, and that's how it all comes together. It's really exciting. Tactical urbanism, I'm sure you all have heard about it. It's another way of really engaging, particularly the younger generations who want to get their hands on with something, engaging with the public, building something that you want. So, takeaways, right? Really start thinking about how walkable places are creating lasting value, putting the people first in your community, looking for where the barriers are and removing them, and then supporting the incremental projects and small-scale development. But most of all, when you build for people, the people will come, and that's where the magic happens. So thank you very much. Pardon? My staff would kill me if I didn't mention that CNU 28, the Twin Cities, will be in June in next year, so sorry. And then finally, there's my contact information. And I have just a couple things to say on that, is that I'm leaving a stack of cards here. If you liked what you heard today, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletters. And if you really liked what we heard today, I encourage you to become a member of CNU. And all of that will translate into increased membership for the CNU Wisconsin chapter. So thank you very much. And I'll be around afterwards if there's any questions.
Thank you, Lynn. I guess not everyone needs 5 bathrooms in their house. She will stick around for questions. I apologize for the short time today. Lynn, Rotary is an international leader in the effort to eradicate polio. We've reduced polio cases by 99.9% worldwide since 1979. Exciting news is that Nigeria was just announced to be free of wild polio virus for the last 3 years, meaning the African region is now going to be certified as polio-free by mid-2020. So we're this close to eradicating polio throughout the world, and in support of that, we're going to make a donation in your name, Lynn, to the Rotary Foundation to purchase 50 additional doses to get us that much closer to eradicating polio. Also, in appreciation for your talk today, we're going to give you a connecting mug. I'm sure you've never had a mug before.
Thank you so much. I was admiring this mug before.
Rotary connects people and resources for the common good, so it'll remind you. I adjourn this meeting.